through how much food, do you have access to food? It's also about your relationship to the prevailing standards of life at the times, right? So, you know, in my own understanding of economic inequality right now, and I think this, you know, they're connected. So we can look right now on the fact that we're all on a Zoom and think about the ways in which if you don't have access to a cell phone or a computer, you know, maybe that's a minor thing, but I think we can probably build an argument that it's a pretty major thing. So we have various ways of thinking about economic inequality, and they have different, maybe for each of us, they have different priorities. Maybe for some of us, we're more concerned about people, making sure people have food or housing. And for some people, maybe that seems like a greater concern. But either way, we have these different ways of understanding it. And then these like more complicated question is what generates these things, right? And so there's a variety of theories about how we get there. And so, yeah, so I mean, like, essentially, like, so like, I mean, I'll say one other thing and I'm going to turn it to Julia, because so I'm working on a paper right now. I was working on it like as I was logging on, right? And it's about this concept called social determinants of health, which many of you might be familiar with. And it's a really powerful concept for understanding health disparities. But at the same time, as I'm reading really kind of an endless array of between really interesting and really boring journal articles about social determinants of health, like at the end of it, we oftentimes can easily get bogged down on the individual causality of like, oh, is it public transportation or is it housing or is it, and when I read this stuff, it's oftentimes annoying to me because like it's about poverty, right? Like those of us who have the means to have a car don't need public transportation. And if we want to argue about that from the sense of climate change, that's a very different discussion and a critically important one, and it has implications for economic inequality and health disparities and all those things. But if we're talking about it just through the frames of like, we have these health disparities, I oftentimes feel like we find increasingly sophisticated ways to talk about something while at the same time displacing the central reality that poverty is the thing, right? And so social determinants of health, although I think it's very useful, I think it has been sort of, it's been normalized in a way that like, when I walk into a room at Rhodes, you know, I teach a lot of classes with health equity folks. They know all the language. They know they can talk very sophisticatedly about it, but we can also have an hour and 15-minute conversation about it without ever mentioning poverty and the fact that that's like an actual thing that is produced and not natural. And we have it, this is where I get into my understanding of economic inequality, but it's produced because a bunch of people win, right? Like people do very well with poverty. And the people who disproportionately shape our policies do very well with a lot of people who are poor. So anyways, I think like when we talk about economic inequality, it's kind of hard to talk about in the abstract. Like, I think it's like most useful to talk about it in relation to what? Like, what is the thing that we're concerned about? And then in my mind, for most of those things, it has a relationship to those things, but it's not always the central or the only relationship, right? And that's where we get into intersectionality. That's where we get into things like white supremacy and the patriarchy and heteronormativity and all the other ways that we sort of express systemic embodied violence. So anyways, I think if we're gonna have a conversation about it, for me, it will be richest if we kind of like try to figure out what's the thing that we want that feels important about it, because in the abstract, I think it quickly loses its power to move people, and we can lose sight of what it actually means, which is like increasing percentage of our society at all these different scales who are like suffering, you know, sort of living through violence that's produced by those things. Anyways, Dr. Hanebrink.
Yeah, all of that. I've been for like a decade been trying to come up with a better term than social determinants of health. It is one that I have never loved. I've tasked my students with trying because I feel like, one, all of what Dr. Hossler just said, I think that we can name all of these things that we see disparities in that we know influences, health outcomes. But determinant, I think, makes it sound very final and that we don't have any agency and that we can't do anything about it. But at the end of the day, the determinant is poverty. And then all of the other aspects are influencers that are under the umbrella of poverty. But we can talk about disparities in public transportation. You're right. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is we have to end poverty. We can't just get more buses. And so keeping things in the abstract, it's a useful, philosophical exercise, but what it does is it helps perpetuates these myths that we cling to, right? The United States we've got a lot of contradictions, really embedded in like just the myth of like meritocracy, right? That if you just work hard enough, you can earn whatever you need. We want to believe that we're an anti-class society and all people are equal, but we know that they're not. We disdain inherited wealth, but we're fascinated by lifestyles of the rich and famous. We resent elites' power and we resent their privilege, but we seek to have the same things that they have. We want their power, we want their privilege. We want to believe that our society is open and fair and mobile. But we know it's closed and unfair and established, and we want to believe that anybody can achieve wealth or power. But we know that very, very, very few actually rise precipitously from modest beginnings. And we want to believe that we're the global gold standard, right? We're number one. We're the standard for democracy, but we live in a kleptocracy where corrupt leaders use their power to exploit others for their own benefit. And so keeping these, we're kind of taught this is embedded within us in the abstract. So, think about everybody here today. Think about what is your vision, your understanding, your experience of the American dream, right? That all people are afforded equal opportunities to succeed. And think about how you learned that ideal and your own family's social and economic history. Like think back as many generations as you can. And has your family stayed in the same socioeconomic class for generations, or has there been mobility? And if there was mobility, what factors made that possible? But really the root of any disparity, whether it be health or wealth or economic or any inequality, is that it's a byproduct of systemic dehumanization of certain groups of people and a denial of access to resources by dominant groups. So yeah, what do you guys want to talk about? Reparations? What you got?
We have some questions prepared. Everyone who has questions can either unmute themselves. I think everyone can unmute themselves, I hope. Or you can type it in the chat box and I'll read it off. But I have some questions that we can start with. All right.
I will say really quickly, sorry, just to give just a little bit of a framework for people that may not have ever been lucky enough to take a class from Dr. Hossler or myself. There's a couple of phrases that you'll probably hear us say that I want to make sure everybody understands. Structural violence is one of those. It's thrown around a lot, but I don't know if people really truly understand what that means. So when we say structural violence, we're talking about how basically like the political and economic organization of a society, those forces structure risk of various forms of suffering within a population. So these are systematic ways, oftentimes barely visible, you got to know where to look, in which these social structures harm or otherwise disadvantage some individuals over another. Paul Farmer kind of made this phrase famous. But he talks about it as kind of these social arrangements that put some individuals or groups of individuals in harm's way and protects others. And they're structural because they're embedded. They're embedded in our economic organization, they're embedded in our political organization, and they're violent because they hurt people. They cause injury to people, they kill people. And it's not a cultural problem. It's not a problem of individual will. We have decided as a society that this is how we're going to operate, and we're okay with it. It is part and parcel of our we have embodied this structural violence. And it's oftentimes economically driven processes that perpetuate it. And the violence is enacted upon anyone whose social status denies them access to the fruits of all of this scientific and social progress that we have. So it is this everyday embedded form of violence that causes people to suffer unequally and unnecessarily. There's also symbolic violence. That's more Bourdieu, if y'all want to get all French theory, similar to structural, but symbolic violence is kind of that's how we're okay with it. We kind of internalize it as normal and natural, that hierarchy is supposed to happen, that there's supposed to be haves and have-nots, that there's supposed to be rich and poor. That is not our default as a species. We created that mess. And we can clean it up if we have a little bit of know-how and a little bit of energy. So I saw some questions coming in, but I just wanted to make sure everybody understood what those two terms meant.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just read off some questions from private chat and from the chat box. So how would reparations for slavery positively impact Black communities?
Pete, you want it? You want me to kick it off?
I mean, like, I think, oh God, this could be really annoying that I'm gonna say this to almost every question. It would depend on what we mean by that, right? And because the thing is like the violence of slavery, which I am not an expert on, and like probably should avoid like trying to position myself in any way as that. But like, you know, it seems pretty clear to me that there's that goes beyond the economic, right? And so it was entirely economic from one perspective, right? And there was a whole host of things that were, you know, extra economic, that were operating in a different sort of register, in a different sort of frame. I think reparations could do positive things on multiple levels, right? I mean, in my mind, there's a symbolic, to go back to Dr. Hanebrink's, there's a symbolic harm, wound that is with this country. And we're seeing that, you know, revisited, not for the first time, but another iteration of the sort of, the ways in which that wound is still so present with us, that I think is entirely symbolic. And I think it's important to note, and I think Dr. Hanebrink, when we say symbolic, we're not in some ways like saying that it's less important, right? It's an expression of a different way in which the violence harms, right? And so I think in some ways reparations, and I think Ta-Nehisi Coates has sort of made this argument that there's like actually an argument just symbolically for it, right? In terms of economics, I think it's more complicated, which is not at all to say that it's not important, right? But like, I would argue that, and you know, and we'll probably get into this, like I'm a Marxist, right? And so like, I fundamentally believe capitalism is one of the central producers of systemic violence, and that it can do no other, right? I do not believe that it has any other option than that, right? So if we're doing reparations within that dominant system, yes, I think it can be helpful. And I think it can potentially redistribute some wealth within the confines of capitalism, but I do not think it gets us anywhere towards some sort of utopian, like, you know, like the capitalism produces its own form of violence. So reparations within the context of capitalism, it can be a good thing, right? But if we're going to talk about economic inequality, it potentially, if done right, has an ability to destabilize the way in which we've wedded economic inequality to you know, racial capitalism, right? It has some potential to disrupt that. But if we're looking for a world in which we aren't dealing with this profound economic inequality, I'm personally not convinced that reparations can do a whole lot for that, right? So which again doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It has a ton of, it's a net good on its own merits. It doesn't have to solve economic inequality in my mind to be like a really powerful and important thing that we should seriously take on in this country. But I also don't think we should have any grand illusions that reparations in the context of staying within capitalism somehow leads to this world that we don't have to have this Zoom meeting, right? Like, I just think it changes it in maybe some important and beneficial ways, but I'm not convinced it ends that.
Yeah, no, I think everything that you just said is absolutely excellent. I think that it's not a solve. It's a helper. It's a little bit of a Band-Aid. But if people think that, oh, if we could just get reparations for everyone, then everything would be okay, that would be, I think, misguided. I mean, we are seeing this. So the protests that are happened in, obviously in reaction to police brutality. Well, just the most recent run. So better policing is one goal, but so is a better life for, many of the country's 44 million plus Black citizens. And so reparations is one way that could improve the quality and quantity of life for people who have been violently denied such for several hundred years. But I think it's also important to remember that reparations isn't just, every Black person gets a check for $200, right? It's not necessarily fully monetary. Just last week, I think it was Asheville, North Carolina, their city council, I think, unanimously voted on a resolution to first formally apologize to its Black citizens for the city's role in slavery and discriminatory housing and other racist policies. But it also called for a plan. It called for a plan to provide reparations in the form of investment. So increasing minority home ownership, I think, was on the list. Increasing minority business ownership and career opportunities, strategies to grow equity and generational wealth. And so it's not just a check. I think some people think that everybody's just going to get, a $100 bill and slavery is going to, like, racism's over, hooray. It is ongoing. It's not just a one and done. It is processual. It's a verb. Reparations is a verb. So I think that resolution created a community reparations committee that's going to be made up of people in the community that will come up with recommendations and plans in both short-term and long-term. But like Dr. Hossler said, as long as you're operating in a capitalist system, I think Dr. Keel in the education lecture earlier this week said, systems operate how they're supposed to. Systems operate as they're designed. The capitalist system is unequal by design. So anything you do within that structure is going to taste a little disparate.
Thank you for that response. We had a question from our group. I think it would be a good follow-up question. So you both mentioned that we've been operating under capitalism for a while and the system itself is flawed and so I wonder if you think, like, what would systemic changes look like for you? Do you think a revolution has to happen, or like how do you think changes will happen?
Marxist, you want to take this one?
I mean, look, like, I think I totally understand where this question's coming from, and it's like, it's deep. It's like part of the kind of, I think, very real intellectual tradition of Marxism, and also part of the mystique of Marxism. And so I would just say, like, it can be easy to get caught up in the, like, how are we going to overthrow capitalism and what's it going to look like? And like, I'm not nearly smart enough to answer either of those two questions. But again, in the same way that I sometimes get frustrated with social determinants of health, I have this thing about this question too, because like for me, the first question isn't how do we overthrow capitalism, right? Yes, I want to do that. I would prefer it to be nonviolent and like that we all can figure out a way to like value the things we say discursively we value, right? Which is like human life. But like, what I would say tactically as first steps is decommodify the crap that is absolutely essential for people to flourish, right? But we don't do that, right? And so it's not complicated to figure out a way to have universal healthcare. Every other Western democracy, for the most part, has figured this out. It's not a ninja skill. Like, we don't need like, luckily many other countries have already done it, so we can sort of borrow their playbook. Or, we're living in a world where, just think about all the bizarre shit we do to try to make sure people who are poor can eat without just saying, hey, have some food, right? And we see all this stuff fall apart right now. Like, we tethered whether an 8-year-old gets to eat breakfast to whether they attend school. That is fucking crazy, right? And like, we're now dealing with the consequences of this. And our country is amazing at developing weird, bizarre, alternative, not very effective, high resource intensive, low efficiency things to provide basic needs. And so what I would say is, like, we don't have to do that. We could solve that without having the Marxist revolution. And we would be building like institutions and infrastructure and cultural norms that say, hey, the basics of human life don't need to be totally determined by your ability to purchase goods in a marketplace that is ostensibly idealized as free, but when we unravel it, as very little of the actual things we're told about capitalism apply to it. So I just say yes to the revolution, but in the meantime, like, I'm really like, I totally get that question. I hope this doesn't come off the wrong way, but in the meantime, let's not worry so much about like what the revolution looks like, and let's like prioritize the decommodification of the very basics of human flourishing. And I don't think the very basics are actually that controversial, like water, food, safe housing, universal healthcare, high quality education for everyone. Like, if we start there, like, we're building capacity, we're building more nourishing communities. I'm sorry.
Yes. I think kind of what, for any psych majors in the room, it's kind of think Maslow, and for the Marxist materialists in the room, that he's talking about hierarchy of needs, right? That we're material beings, that we're part of the natural world, but we also create our own social world within it. And as material beings, we have to satisfy our basic material needs first, like Dr. Hossler said, eating, drinking, food, shelter, clothing. That has to be met before we can pursue higher developmental needs and realize our whole human potential. So as long as some people are stuck trying to meet their basics, that needle's never going to move. And capitalist societies, the vast majority are relegated to conditions in which we're caught in this constant struggle to meet our most basic needs, despite this enormous amount of wealth that's been created over centuries of growth, right? We still have millions upon millions of people in even the wealthiest of societies in really, really precarious conditions, just for their basic needs. In the meantime, we have 3 billionaires in the United States owning as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. Like, we don't have an equilibrium. So I think balancing the metabolism, maintaining a sense of equilibrium is more revolutionary than just burning shit down. It's understanding how systems connect. So we've got, and it's beyond just economy and race, right? Ecology and environment are thrown in here too. And I think we're learning that lesson the hard way right now. We've got local and regional and global environments that have been put in danger, as have most of the ecosystems in the world. And these are being sacrificed in the name of cost efficiency, right? Cost efficiency is just basically a euphemism for cheap labor and cheap land. And what that's doing is it's pushing multinational corporations, particularly agribusiness, in the pathogen world. Agribusinesses are driving a lot of these novel viruses that are being introduced to us. I can talk a little bit more about that in a second. But so we've got these global commodity chains. So it's not just going to be reparations, right? It's got to be restructuring these chains and reprioritizing these chains and balancing the impact of the economic and the social and the political and the environmental. So we've got this system of, and we valorize this global system, but the free market and how wonderful all of these technologies that we have are. But what the system does is it treats land and it treats bodies and it treats species and it treats ecosystems as basically free stuff to be exploited and expropriated, irrespective of limits, both natural and social, by those in power. So I think the more kind of revolutionary change that's needed is really understanding how to regulate this social and political metabolism that we have. We don't need more exploitation or expropriation or imperialism and war. We need less of that. So whatever is going to get us there is what we need to do. I think Marx called it the planetary metabolism, or some. Peter, you can tell me. But he was saying that basically that's the most pressing necessity to determine our survival now and of our species in the future is this preservation of a viable planetary metabolism where no one is taking or giving too much.
Yeah, I have a follow-up in private chat. So what about universal basic income? Say like 40,000 per, that's crazy. Sorry, numbers. Say like 4,000 per month and pay it with a really progressive income tax.
Sure, I'm down for universal basic anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like those things are all, we won't know. I mean, UBI, if you read about it, and it is complicated, and there's like an opportunity for, I mean, we have issues with inflation that really could wipe out some of the gains of UBI, but we don't know. We've never tried it. And like I mean, I'm not going to get in the weeds here because I imagine most of you don't want to hear it, but like, and I'll use a quick example to say we get told this all the time. Like, and I'm kind of going to do this now. Like, so inflation is an issue with UBI. And if you want to go read about that, you can. And it is a real issue. I don't think it's like, not everybody is saying that is intellectually dishonest and just wants to like keep things as it is. But that said, like, why not give it a shot? We're constantly told inflation's going to happen. We've been told inflation's going to happen. If you like read macroeconomic policy, every time there's concern that like people are making too much money, people start complaining that inflation's going to happen, and it hasn't happened. And so even during the boom to the .com, so I'd be totally up to try it. The Marxist in me still wants to say that universal basic income that maintains the general tenor of the market, the way we organize it, which, I should say capitalism itself is still crazy. It's not crazy. Yes. Sorry. I lost my train of thought. It's not one thing, right? There isn't one capitalism. There are many, many capitalisms. And that is both true of different countries, and that is true of different ages. And in the US, we even have sort of local capitalisms. And what I mean by that is like, we're seeing this play out really clearly right now with the unemployment, right? Some states have very generous unemployment rates relative to what Tennessee has, right? And so that actually makes real huge differences in the way capitalism works here, right? Because like, if the unemployment benefit can make you survive, you don't have to take the worst terrible job that you get offered. And I don't want to like celebrate that as like, that's not my version of revolution. But it's also true that that's a more humane capitalism than what we have in Tennessee, where like you can't survive even on unemployment oftentimes, right? So there isn't one capitalism, but in general, what we're living through right now is neoliberal capitalism, which is a very particular expression of it, and a very violent version of it, right? It was violent before. It's been violent all the time, but neoliberal capitalism is more violent in terms of in terms of its structural approach, right? And again, I want to be really careful here because there's been violence, you know, the US has a long history of violence that manifests itself through many different of our social structures. And some of those have been fairly consistent through time in our country. We think about identity in particular, but US capitalism did, in my mind, get materially worse beginning in the 1980s. And we've been sort of accelerating on that path since then. You know, so, and I think anything that reduces harm is net positive. So, yeah, so UBI, like, yes, we should totally try. It's kind of like the answer to reparations. We should, yeah, let's do it, right? Let's do it because it's important to like try some of these things, and maybe they get us to the goalpost. I suspect they won't, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try them and then figure out what the next game plan is to eventually get us to that goalpost. So yay UBI, but I do think we have to be sort of cautious because I don't know that it's the panacea that I want to believe it is.
This is kind of a follow-up. Do you think there's a breaking point at which companies and governments must change their behaviors in favor of people instead of profit? What would it take?
I mean, the breaking point is on us, not on the corporations. How much can we withstand? I mean, because we are complicit in this violence, right? We also embody this violence. I've got a bunch of Amazon boxes sitting on my porch right now, if nobody believes me. So, I mean, as long as, until change is absolutely fundamentally demanded, it won't come. Corporations are going to hang on for as long as they can. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that there's like a measurable, identifiable breaking point. It's just their bottom line. And I mean, Peter, help me out here.
Can you ask the question again? Sorry, I'm like thinking about it and just, sorry.
No, of course. Do you think there's a breaking point at which companies and governments must change their behaviors in favor of people instead of profit?
Yeah, I totally believe there's a breaking point. Yep. I don't know when it is, right? Like, I mean, this is the hopeful part of me. Like, I totally believe there's a breaking point. And I think we see little, but the breaking point isn't like, oh, the corporations and governments lay down and like we get the socialist utopia because the breaking point hit, right? The breaking point is, and I think like Marxist theorists, and not just Marxists, but social movement, you don't have to be a Marxist, social movement theorist, like in various ways, and probably, I mean, I think structuralists in general, right? Like radical change is the intersection of opportunity and movement, right? Like it's when capacity to seize the moment is present, right? We've seen various moments of crises in capitalism in the past, and you know, it's like I'm getting older now, and now I've lived through several of these, right? Like I was doing my PhD during 2008, which I know for many of you who are students currently, it's like, I now realize you guys don't have any concept of that, but it was like this existential crisis of capitalism. And there was all this like energy around like, this is the moment. And nothing happened, right? Like literally nothing happened. It turned into the largest like state-sponsored theft of wealth for the rich. Like literally our government handed over billions to borderline trillions of dollars to rich people, right? As the salvation of our economy, right? So I'm really heartened by, you know, like the Black Lives Matters movement, and like this is all about capacity building, right? And like, and it's about finding ways in which movements that might have independent priorities, if they have to list like their 3 missions, find synergies, right? Find like areas of like, because the truth is like ending economic inequality doesn't solve racism in the same way racism doesn't solve economic inequality, but there's like some really fruitful, I think, ways in which like moving towards both of those things helps both of those things, right? And so, yeah, I totally believe, I mean, I think it's hard. I don't think you can be a Marxist if you don't believe that, right? And so maybe it's like my maybe it's just because I was brainwashed when I was in college and I got turned into a Marxist and now I have to believe this. But no, I mean, I think capitalism is inherently unstable. Like poverty is unstable, right? It creates, like, violence is unstable, right? These are existential crises to humans and their families and neighborhoods, and it leads to instability. And we see that all the time, right? And I think we're, even now with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think lots of people smarter than me about movements like this are writing things like, part of the reason this momentum has been sustained for so long is because it's also tethered to a massive moment of economic insecurity where people have been made unemployed, right? And so in some weird ways, they have more time to be on the streets, because that's one of the things that always hurts movement building is, like, it's very hard. The people with the most at stake are oftentimes also the same people with the least time to like trying to manage the 3 low-wage jobs and be able to be on the streets every night. Like, that's asking a lot of those communities, right? And so yeah, I think it's like, I think we have to be hopeful. And I think, you know, this moment of crisis that we're having through the pandemic, I see it everywhere, that there's fissures, there's cracks. You know, like, we passed paid leave in this country, and it's not forever, and they'll try to take it back. And, like, I'm not trying to, like, we couldn't get that path. And think about how messed up that is. Like, we live in a country where we tell people, if you're sick, and especially people who work in frontline services, because people like Rhodes professors can just take the day off when they're sick, but we tell them you're sick and you have to go to work. Like, that is insanity, not just inhumane and unethical for those human beings, but for all of us, right? And that got passed in like a day, right? After like 200 years, we couldn't do that. And it happened in a day. And that was not because, you know, yes, it was because a lot of work had been put in, but that was also because there was a crisis of capitalism, right? And it necessitated it. So it's about whether we're whether we can seize power and seize moments when they're there. So yeah, I'm totally, like, I fully believe it is possible, and that capitalism is unsustainable, and the environmental stuff that Dr. Hanebrink mentioned is another way in which this horizon is ever present.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to add to that. Thanks, Peter. Yeah. So when I said, like, the breaking point isn't theirs, it's ours. They're multinational corporations or even local corporations are. I'm not going to hold my breath for them to grow a conscience, right? So the onus is on regulations and policies and us. Governments have an obligation to ensure the safety of their citizens, yes. But any disparities that we're living with right now are also reflections of a society's commitment to equity and justice. So to combat any injustice, whether it be economic or the health crisis or whatever, we have a responsibility to take action at all levels. And Dr. also brings up an important point. Those of us least effective probably have the most flexibility in terms of taking action. And that's at the individual, community, regional, national, and global levels. So, and I'm not just, there's actual, like, concrete things that you can do. It's not just like, oh, just take action, do better. Like, there's stuff you can do. You got to oppose national and international policies that turn health into a commodity. And that permits this kind of rapid exploitation and destruction of fragile ecosystems. And you can do that easily. You can call, believe it or not, you can call your member of Congress and they will call you back. I've had not a lot of time on my hands. I've just been home a lot. And I haven't spent a whole lot of time in politicians' offices. I spent a lot of time in the field. I spent a lot of time in abjectly poor communities. And so I never kind of studied up or talked up. My interest was in raising the voices of the people who are being systematically silenced. But that wasn't getting us anywhere. So I sent an email to a member of Congress and I said, I want to talk to you about some of the issues. This was a couple of weeks ago. I want to talk to you about some of the issues in the upcoming CARES Act package. I had very specific things I wanted to talk about. Do you have some time? And within hours, one of the legislative aides had emailed me back, and we had a meeting by the end of the week. And I've talked to every member of Congress. Well, not Marsha Blackburn, because why? But I talked to every other member of Congress in both Tennessee and beyond. And they were really receptive to some of these ideas. Like, okay, well, how could we make this better? What can we do? You know, the US taxpayers are spending $7.5 billion and counting on COVID drug research, yet Gilead gets to set the price. That's fucked up. Let's go ahead and get a policy going saying that any medication, any biomedical technologies, be it vaccinations or medication or treatment that is paid for in any part with taxpayer dollars remain in the public domain. Like, that's an actionable item. We need to contribute our research to a global patent pool to make sure that low and middle income countries have access to that technology. That's an actionable item. So getting on the phone with your local and national legislators, sending them emails, they read them. They have people that their sole job is to count who's for and who's against whatever is coming up on the table, and basically at the end of the day, whichever pro-con list is longer wins. So that's on us. We have to demand some of this radical transformation, right? Both nationally and internationally, right? We have international financial institutions that are driving a lot of this. This isn't just on us. I mean, the United States has done some terrible things, but that was part and parcel of what the rest of the world was doing as well in terms of exploitation. So we have these international financial institutions that are perpetuating a lot of these inequalities while claiming to be working to solve them, which is just bonkers. We have international health organizations that are supposed to be preventing some of these crises, but in reality, they're actually contributing to some of them because of how political things like this. Pandemics are first political before anything else, then social, then biological, I think in that order. So we have to demand this radical transformation of these institutions and we have to demand that they respond to some of these inequities and challenges in a manner that benefits the most vulnerable, and instead of these top-down approaches that are linked to corporate interests. Like, we have to say no to that, to whoever needs to hear it. We can demand that governments and organizations reformulate or create or implement or enforce policies that respect fundamental basic human rights, including the right to health. That also includes reproductive health and sexual self-determination, because that's linked to poverty. So we have to be able we have to oppose all coercive measures and family planning policies because that intersects here. So that's another actionable item that both gets at roots of racism and gets at roots of sexism and gets at roots of economic inequalities. And we have to either build or join these really broad-based popular movements. We have to pressure people, we have to pressure governments, we have to pressure corporations to incorporate economic justice into their game plan. And we have to celebrate the small wins, right? We also have to thank those that are doing this. We can't just be mad all the time, right? We have to promote and support and engage and encourage people. And we have to get informed and get involved. And you're all doing that now, right? Just by being here as researchers or students or health professionals or whoever you are, just even having this conversation is a step in the right direction. But COVID isn't the only pandemic that we're dealing with right now. Racism is a pandemic. Poverty is a pandemic. And pandemics aren't over anywhere until they are over everywhere. So it takes a global community to stop these things and prevent them from happening again. Getting off my soapbox.
Thank you for that answer. This one is for you. Can you contrast and describe your experiences with working with communities versus working with policies advocacy? Pros and cons for both.
Oh gosh. Peter, you can answer this too, because you spend a lot of time you spend more time in policy than I do. But you also spend time in communities with people that are affected by said policies. I am much more comfortable in a community setting, just having conversations with people, meeting with a member of Congress, meeting with political officials. Those aren't conversations, those are performances. You're not just having like, how is this impacting you? What are your worries? What are your concerns? Those are the questions that I ask people in communities. I'm not asking, Lamar Alexander, how is, what are your existential, like, what's your everyday lived experience, Lamar? So it's, it's a dance I had to learn. It's a language I had to speak, and it's new to me. I've been an activist for a long time. I'm new to advocacy, and it's a little bit, activism is, what you think of, taking to the streets, writing the letters, signing the petition, throwing your fist in the air. Advocacy is actually talking to the people that can impact the policies, or that write the policies, or that can vote for the policies. And so it has been an interesting learning process, but Peter has much more years of experience in policy meetings than I do. So I'm gonna let him weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're totally different, and they're both important, and not everybody has to do both. I mean, you don't get progressive policy without progressive activism, and you don't get that without community, right? Like, what I would say important policy towards equity that we've made in this country has been because of activism enabled policy, right? And so, like, both are critically important. I think, they're very different. Like, they're just completely different, right? Activism is something that I've never been particularly good at. And, to my own shame, right? So I'll self-admit that right now. And I try to find ways to resource local activists in the ways I can, right? So, I made maps for Memphis for All, and there's a certain technical thing that I can do. I think, they're dialectically related. They both are absolutely critically important. There's tension within them, right? And because it is in fact the job of activists, I would say, good activists make demands that are sort of uncompromising, and we need that. Policy doesn't happen in that same space, and I'm not making that as an excuse. It's just a very different. It's the way it's structured makes radical change very tricky in most policy environment. Like, political sciences would call it path dependency. Like, we are in some ways wedded to the mistakes we've already made, barring like massive political disruption, which I'm all for, but doesn't happen often, right? So I think the thing is like, they're both critically important. If you find yourselves, we all need to become better activists, and like what Dr. Hanebrink was talking about calling your congressperson, it's a really easy entry to active. I don't mean that the wrong way. Like, it takes time and commitment, but like and I know some of you may not be Rhodes students, and I'm sorry if you're like a Memphis student. I just haven't been in a Memphis classroom, so it's harder for me to talk about those classrooms. I suspect it's the same. I think all of you would find calling your congressman actually really easy, right? Like, the harder part is making the time and feeling comfortable doing it. Like, it's a weird thing to do. For most of these issues, people will give you scripts and talking points. Like, you can go to whatever organization is working in the area of your concern, whether it's reproductive rights or environmental justice or anti-racist or all the important stuff, and they can help you with that. And so I think that's like a great way, if you haven't done it a lot, to like do it, because it is like, once you sort of get the thing, and Dr. Hanebrink's right, like to some degree it kind of doesn't matter what you say, because like, let's be honest, like Lamar probably doesn't agree with anything Dr. Hanebrink says, or not a lot, but Lamar is a politician, and Lamar is going to respond to political pressure in certain ways. And so Dr. Hanebrink doesn't necessarily have to like make Lamar want to read the Communist Manifesto to have an impact on what Lamar is thinking in terms of education policy. So I would say that I think policy is just very complicated. And the thing about policy too is like humans are complicated. And truthfully, this is just one of the great, it's like what makes the social sciences awesome for me, but it's like the great limitation is like, I use this example in one of my classes. I'm a geographer, right? And like there's this guy named Tobler, and he's got one of the only laws in geography, right? It's called Tobler's Law. And Tobler's law is that things that are close are more similar than things that are far apart, right? And I just use that as an example of like, it's really hard to come up with a law of human behavior. Like Tobler gets his name on something that's like pretty benign. Like, oh, you're telling me that things that are closer tend to be more similar than things that are fall apart. He gets like the law in geography. And the reason that is human beings are really complicated. And the reason I'm saying that is that makes policy really complicated, because you can institute policy that you think is good and gonna do, I think there are, just as our history of our country is full of white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist policies, but it's also full of some policies that I think were actually done with good intentions that didn't work, because human beings are fickle and we don't respond in ways that we think. So policy is just really, really tricky. And I think regardless the policy and activism question, and Dr. Hanebrink alluded to this, and I think right now is a particularly challenging time for me anyways to keep this centered, but I think it's really important, which is like not losing hope and not feeling a lack of agency, right? And so whatever you're gonna scratch itch you need to scratch, like whether it's activism or getting involved in policy, I think the most important thing is to like center hope and center agency, that like these things do not have to be this way. And we can change them, right? But they're hard, and we also have to deal with disappointment in that regard. So yeah, I offered nothing there, and I apologize.
No, I think everything that you said, and for those that, because I know we're running out of time, I'm going to do just some shameless plugs, or just for ways that y'all can get involved with some of this stuff. And it's you know, calling Steve Cohen isn't, you know, end all be all, right? And if you're not comfortable with that, there's a million other ways to get your voice heard. There's also a lot of different ways to, like, you know, boycotting or whatever it's called, you know, like voting with your dollar, letting companies, you know, like not purchasing products from unethical companies. It's just a really simple everyday way thing you can do. But so there is a relatively new organization that I'm a part of. It's just a group, it's a grassroots organization of volunteers across the country that are concerned about these pandemics that are going on, of racism and COVID. It's called Right to Health Action. And that is a really great group if you want to learn how to have these conversations with your members of Congress. It is like, it's meeting with your congressperson for dummies. I am so grateful for all of the resources that they provided. They pretty much just walk you through it. We do a practice run. You basically come up with how you're going to do it just to go through the motions before you get on the call. It doesn't take as much time as you would think. And they're hosting these really amazing webinars. So their next one is called COVID, Climate, and Community on August 2nd. But this organization, we need students, we need professionals to sign up for local actions, to be state and regional organizers at every skill set. You don't have to be a poli-sci major. We need some people that are just good at graphic design. We need some people that are in the legal community. We need some people in the arts community. We need some people in the history community. So whatever you can bring to the table, there's a place for you there. And I can send on to the links for these, but it's r2hwebin.org. Locally, there are organizations. The Center for Transforming Communities is one. They're trying to help residents in Binghamton at, I think, the Woodcrest Apartments. And they're also doing this is housing justice stuff, neighborhood organizing in North Memphis and Orange Mound. There's the Right to the City Alliance, which is a housing justice organization, if that's your jam. United Campus Workers, students can join United Campus Workers, the Campus Workers Union that's fighting for all kinds of things for campus workers, both adjunct professors and housekeeping and student workers and all of the above. The 515 campaign always has actions going on, and those intersect a lot with some of the other actions that are happening. And there's another link, it's called the Reparations for Black People Fund resource. Has anybody, if y'all have seen that? You basically, I'm gonna send y'all the link. People are just donating money, and any person of color that needs it can ask, and they're doling it back out. Basically kind of creating their own reparations, but it's an amazing resource document that has all of these other links to, if you're interested in education, if you're interested in housing justice, if you're interested in reproductive justice, there are different places that you can go. So I'll send that link as well, just for some resources on where to start and how to wade into these waters.
Can I just add one other thing too? Figure out a way to encourage yourselves and your friends to vote. And I don't say that to celebrate and fetishize democracy. I'm not really into it in that way, but statistically speaking, y'all don't vote. Right. And I'm not saying that personally, but it's a major problem, and I embodied that problem. I don't think I voted once the 4 years I was an undergraduate. And that's shameful now. And now I'm advocating that you do something that I did not do. And I was stupid and lazy and not prioritizing the right things at that time in my life. But the system really benefits from that, right? So trying to think creatively about how do you get your friends, your colleagues, your people you work with to vote, and making that a priority. And for those of you who are on a college campus, asking your institution to help make that easy, right? Asking your institution to prioritize that and to make that something that the institution is facilitating, right? Because it's a little bit harder sometimes to vote if you're a college student. You need an absentee ballot and those types of things, but it's so critically important as a tool, right? Not as a tool of solving all of this, but as a tool for that momentum building, for that sending signals that these issues can't be ignored. And so that's a really small act in some ways, but it's one we have not as a society done well in activating young people to do that. And that's by design, right? And so we gotta figure out ways to solve that, because from every poll, all the polling data suggests we might live in a different world if you all were the voting bloc that you could be. And so we need you to vote. And if you have ideas of what I can do as a faculty member to help promote that, please send them to me offline, because it's another important part of the story.
Yeah, of course. We actually did a voter empowerment program. We have infographics
Awesome.
on our Facebook page that shows you how to request advocacy ballot and all that. So if you need help with voting, let me know. I'll help you out. I'm an international student, so I don't have to vote, but I'll help you out. Thank you guys so much for coming. This was a great discussion, and I want to thank Dr. Hossler and Dr. Hanebrink for being here. We will have our next webinar next Tuesday on alienship. That will be our last one, so show up and support. It will be from our peers, so it will be fun. All right, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.